The card declined again. A cold Tuesday morning in Seattle, the kind where the sky sits low and gray like a held breath. The coffee shop smelled of burnt espresso and wet wool, and every person in line behind the man was staring at their phone, except they weren't. Not really. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal coat that looked expensive, even wrinkled. His jaw was set. His daughter, maybe 6, clutching a unicorn backpack against her chest, tugged his sleeve and whispered something Ava couldn't hear. She recognized that look on his face, not embarrassment. Worse, the specific shame of a person who is used to having control, watching it slip in public. Ava stepped forward and paid without thinking. He thanked her. She never asked his name. She walked to work and forgot about him entirely. That was her first mistake. Ava Bennett had a system. Every morning before leaving her apartment, she checked the same 3 things her father's pill organizer on the kitchen counter, the balance notification on her banking app, and the weather. Not because she was anxious, or at least that's what she told herself, but because surprises had a way of being expensive, and expensive was something she couldn't afford right now. The pill organizer was full. The balance was lower than she'd like. The weather said 41 degrees with a chance of rain, which in Seattle meant certainty. She pulled on her coat and walked to work the same route she always did, stopping at the same coffee shop on the corner of 5th, and Lenora, the one with the steamed-up windows and the barista who never smiled but always got her order right. She wasn't a regular out of loyalty. She was a regular because the coffee was $2 cheaper than the place next door, and it was directly on the way. That Tuesday morning, the line was longer than usual. Ava stood 4 people back, scrolling through her phone, a message from her father's cardiologist office, confirming next week's appointment, a reminder about a project deadline from Trevor, sent at 11:30 the previous night, as if that were a normal time to send work emails. She silenced her screen and looked up. That was when she noticed him. He was near the front of the line, a tall man in a charcoal overcoat, the kind of coat that looked like it had cost something once and had since been lived in. He wasn't on his phone. He was standing very still, with the particular stillness of someone trying not to draw attention to themselves, which was already failing. Beside him, holding his hand with both of hers, was a small girl with a unicorn backpack, the soft kind, with a silver horn and pastel wings, and the expression of a child trying very hard to look unbothered. The card reader beeped. Not the good beep, the flat, dismissive one. The barista said something low. The man reached into his coat pocket, produced a different card, and slid it through. Another beep. Same tone. Behind Ava, someone exhaled loudly. 2 people shifted their weight. The small sounds of a line losing patience. The man's jaw tightened. His daughter tugged his sleeve and said something Ava couldn't hear her voice, barely above a whisper. He shook his head once short and sharp, and tried the card again. Ava recognized that look on his face. She had seen it before, not on strangers, but on her own father years ago at a pharmacy counter, when the insurance claim was denied, and there were people waiting, and the pharmacist was already moving on to the next customer. That specific expression. Not humiliation exactly, but the near cousin of it. The look of a person who is ordinarily capable and composed, watching both things fail at once in a public place. She stepped forward before she'd made a conscious decision to. "I've got it," she said to the barista. She tapped her card before either of them could object. The machine beeped. The good beep this time. The man turned to look at her. Up close, he was somewhere in his mid-30s, dark-haired with the faint shadow of someone who hadn't slept enough and was pretending not to notice. He wasn't what she would have described as thrown, more like recalibrating the way a person looks when something happens outside the expected order of events. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "The line was backing up," Ava said, which was true, but not the reason. "I'm Lucas," he extended his hand. "Lucas Reed." "Ava," she shook it. "Bennett. I work just down the block, Horizon Creative on 2nd. She said it the way people say things in passing, the conversational reflex of filling a moment. Lucas nodded. His expression didn't change. The little girl peered around her father's arm and looked at Ava with the frank, unfiltered assessment that only young children can pull off without being rude. "I'm Sophie," she announced. "You look like someone from a fairy tale." Lucas closed his eyes briefly. "Sophie?" "What she does." Ava smiled despite herself. "Thank you, Sophie. I like your backpack." Sophie looked down at it as though she'd forgotten it was there, then looked back up with sudden seriousness. "The horn lights up, but only when it's dark." The barista set 2 hot chocolates and a coffee on the counter. Lucas picked them up, carefully balancing all 3, and looked at Ava with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not just gratitude, but something more deliberate, like he was making a note. "Thank you," he said. "Genuinely." "Don't worry about it," she said, and meant it. She was already turning toward the door when Sophie called after her. "Bye, fairy tale lady." Ava walked the remaining 6 blocks to Horizon Creative with her hands in her pockets and a small warmth in her chest that she didn't analyze too closely. It was a good thing that happened on the way to work. Those existed sometimes. She filed it away and let it go. Horizon Creative occupied the top 2 floors of a glass building on 2nd Avenue, and on paper, it was exactly the kind of place Ava had wanted to work when she was 23, and finishing her communications degree, and believed that good ideas were enough to get you somewhere. 6 years later, she was a project coordinator, which meant she managed timelines, tracked deliverables, wrote the briefs that other people presented, and attended the meetings where other people's names appeared on the slide decks she'd built. She was good at it. Quietly, consistently good. In a way that was easy to overlook precisely because nothing went wrong. Her direct manager, Trevor Kane, had built an entire career on that principle. Trevor was the kind of person who arrived late to meetings and left early, who had an instinct for walking into a room exactly when something important was being said and positioning himself close enough to claim adjacency. He was charming in the way that certain people in certain industries learn to be surface-level warm, strategically attentive, capable of making you feel seen in the moment and invisible in the minutes after. His performance reviews were glowing. His team's retention rate was the worst in the company. Nobody connected those 2 facts out loud. That morning, Ava arrived at her desk to find a new task added to her project board. Without discussion, a full competitive analysis for a pitch deck Trevor was presenting on Friday. It had been assigned to her at 11:42 the previous night, marked urgent, with a note that read, "Already discussed with the client, just needs the research filled in," which meant Trevor had made commitments on a timeline he hadn't checked with her and was now presenting the gap as her job to fill. She opened the task. She looked at it for a moment. Then she opened a different folder, the one she kept locked on her personal drive, not the shared company system. A document she had been building quietly for almost 2 years. Dates, project names, deliverables. Her name removed, Trevor's name added. The record of a pattern she couldn't prove to anyone who didn't want to see it, but that she needed to exist somewhere outside of her own memory. She added the new entry, closed the folder, started the research. This was the math she had made her peace with. Her father's health insurance was tied to her employment. His cardiologist was in network. The specialist he'd seen 3 times last year was in network. The medications that kept his heart functioning at something approaching normal were covered at 70% because of the plan she carried through Horizon. If she lost this job, or if she made enough noise to become the kind of employee who got managed out, that coverage disappeared. So she did the work. She let Trevor present it. She kept the file. It wasn't dignity exactly, but it was a version of control, and control was something she understood. The next morning, the email came at 7:46. All staff mandatory, all hands meeting 9 a.m. main conference room. Attendance required. No agenda, no context. sent from an address Ava didn't recognize. Not Trevor, not the department head, but a name from the parent company she'd seen on an organizational chart once and never thought about again. Reed Capital Group. She read it twice, got dressed, arrived at 8:50 to find the conference room already half full and the entire floor buzzing with the low-frequency tension of people who have been told something is happening without being told what. Trevor was at the front of the room standing with his arms crossed and his expression arranged into something that was meant to look confident. Ava knew his face well enough to read underneath it. He was uneasy. At 9:02, the door opened. Lucas Reed walked in wearing a different coat. Than the day before, navy pressed no sign of yesterday's wrinkles, with two people she didn't recognize following behind him carrying folders. He moved to the front of the room without looking around, the way newcomers usually do without the small behavioral markers of someone entering unfamiliar space. He looked like a man who had been in this room before, or at least in rooms like it, enough times that the geometry no longer required his attention. He looked up. His eyes found Ava's across the conference table. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like the click of a detail falling into place. She felt the floor do something strange beneath her. "Good morning," Lucas said, addressing the room. "My name is Lucas Reed. As of this week, Reed Capital Group has completed its acquisition of Horizon Creative, and I'll be stepping in as the acting CEO during the transition period." He let that settle for exactly 2 seconds. "I want to be direct with you about why we've called this meeting." He opened the folder in front of him. What followed was not a speech. It was a presentation of findings, specific, documented, delivered without theater. Internal communications, manipulated performance reviews, a pattern of credit misattribution going back 4 years, spanning 11 employees across 2 departments. Every entry sourced, every date confirmed. Ava did not look at Trevor. She looked at the table in front of her. Lucas's voice was even throughout. Not cold, not prosecutorial, just precise. The voice of someone who had decided that clarity was more respectful than drama. "Trevor Kane's employment with Horizon Creative is terminated effective immediately," Lucas said. "Security will assist him in collecting his personal items. I'd ask everyone else to remain seated. There's more I want to share about the path forward." Trevor stood. His chair scraped back too loud. He said something, one sharp sentence that Ava didn't fully process, because her mind was occupied with a different detail entirely. "Yesterday morning. The coffee shop. I've got it." The card reader beeping. Lucas's face when he turned around. He had known exactly who she was and where she worked. She had told him herself that offhand mention of Horizon Creative on second. At the time, it meant nothing. Now she understood it had meant everything. His investigation had been complete for weeks, every element sourced and verified, except for one thread that kept slipping. No current employee had been willing to confirm. On record that the pattern was systematic rather than isolated. Then a woman in a coffee shop line, describing her manager's habits with the casual specificity of someone who had stopped being surprised by them, had handed him the last piece without knowing she was holding it. The realization sat in her chest, quiet and heavy, as the room around her rearranged itself into something she didn't yet have a name for. In the drawer of her desk, 2 floors up, a locked folder waited. She hadn't decided what to do with it yet. But for the first time in 2 years, the decision felt like hers to make. The week after Trevor's termination, Horizon Creative felt like a house, after a storm, structurally intact, but full of the small sounds of things settling. People were polite to Ava in a way they hadn't been before, which was its own kind of discomfort. In the break room, conversation stopped a half-beat too late when she walked in. A colleague named Dana, who sat 2 desks over and had never initiated conversation in 18 months, suddenly found reasons to stop by Ava's workspace twice a day. A project manager named Greg, who had been Trevor's most reliable ally, began CCing her on emails. She had no reason to be on, not out of inclusion, She understood, but out of something closer to insurance. The theory, as best she could reconstruct it from fragments of overheard conversation, was that Ava had known. That she and Lucas Reed had some prior arrangement. That the coffee shop story, which someone had told someone who had told the floor, was either too convenient to be accidental or too small to be the whole truth. She didn't correct it. Correcting it would have required explaining it, and she didn't have an explanation that would satisfy people who had already decided what had happened. So she came in, did her work, and let the silence speak for her in whatever language people chose to hear. What she didn't tell anyone was that she had submitted the file. 3 days after the all-hands meeting, she had printed it, 41 pages of dates and entries, every instance she had documented over nearly 2 years, sealed it in an envelope, and left it on the desk of Lucas's interim assistant with her name and extension written on the front. No cover letter, no request. She had simply decided that if the information was useful, it should exist somewhere other than a locked folder on her personal drive. Lucas had acknowledged it exactly once in a brief email sent late that same evening. "Thank you. This will be part of the record." LR, that was all. Which was, she had decided exactly the right amount. The hospital called on a Thursday. Her father, Robert, had been admitted that morning, after his cardiologist flagged an irregularity during a routine check. Not a crisis, the nurse on the phone was careful to use that word twice, but significant enough to require observation and an adjustment to his medication protocol. He would likely be in for 3 to 4 days. He was comfortable. He was asking for the crossword book from his nightstand. Ava took a 2-hour lunch drove to the hospital, delivered the crossword book, and sat with him for 40 minutes. Robert Bennett was 63 years old and had the particular stubbornness of a man who had spent decades doing physical work and had not yet fully accepted that his body was operating under new management. He told her he was fine. He told her to stop looking at him like that. He told her the nurse kept mispronouncing his last name, and he had decided not to correct her because it was funny. Ava drove back to the office and ran the numbers in her head for the 14th time that month. The medication adjustment would mean a prescription change. Prescription changes meant a waiting period before the new dosage qualified for full coverage. There would be a gap. She had estimated somewhere between $400 and $500 out of pocket, depending on which pharmacy and which tier the new formulation landed on. She didn't have that sitting in reserve. She had been building toward it, and she was still short. She didn't tell anyone this. She had gotten very good over the years at carrying the financial architecture of her life in her head, without letting it show on her face. It was a skill nobody complimented you for, but it was one of the most demanding things she did. Back at her desk, she opened the project file she'd been working on and kept going. Lucas Reed's days at Horizon Creative followed a pattern that Ava observed the way she observed most things, not by looking directly, but by noticing the edges. He arrived early. He held door-open sessions twice a week, where any employee could come speak to him directly. No manager required no prior approval. He read the briefing documents himself, rather than waiting for summaries. These were not dramatic gestures. They were operational habits, and their effect was quieter and more durable than any speech he could have given. He also, she noticed, always had his phone face down on whatever surface he was working at, and he checked it with the frequency of a man, waiting for a specific message that hadn't arrived yet. She learned the reason from his assistant, incidentally, during a conversation about a scheduling overlap. Lucas's daughter, Sophie, was enrolled at an elementary school 20 minutes from the office. He picked her up personally every day at 3:15, without exception, rescheduling anything that conflicted. He had missed her school pickup exactly once in the past year, the day his wife's accident was confirmed as fatal, and Ava understood from the way the assistant said it, that this fact sat in him like a fixed point around which everything else was arranged. She did not mention that she knew any of this. She moved on. The afternoon Sophie came to the office was a Wednesday in late October. Lucas had back-to-back calls that ran 40 minutes over, and the school called to say Sophie had been dropped off in the lobby by a parent volunteer. She was sitting in one of the chairs near the front desk when Ava came back from the printer unicorn backpack in her lap, reading a picture book with the focused expression of a child who had learned to wait. Ava sat down in the chair next to her, not because she had a plan, but because a 6-year-old sitting alone in a corporate lobby was not something she could walk past. "The horn still only lights up in the dark?" Ava asked. Sophie looked up. It took her a second, and then something clicked in her expression. Recognition warm and immediate. "You're the fairy tale lady." "Ava," she said. "You can call me Ava." Sophie considered this. "I'll call you both." They sat for a moment. Sophie turned a page in her book, then closed it without finishing the thought she'd been following. "Do you get scared?" Sophie asked, with the abrupt sincerity that children deploy without warning, of losing people. Ava looked at her. "Yes. My dad doesn't say he's scared," Sophie said, "but he sleeps with the hallway light on. He thinks I don't notice." Outside the window, the last of the afternoon light was going flat and gray over the water. "My dad is sick," Ava said. "Not always scary sick, but the kind where I think about it a lot. The kind where you sit in a waiting room and you don't know what the doctor is going to say when she comes out." Sophie turned to look at her with an expression that was several years older than 6. "My mom used to buy hot chocolate for 3 people," she said. "Now my dad only buys 2. He never says anything about it. He just orders 2. Ava felt something tighten in her throat. "That's how you know he misses her," Sophie said, in the tone of someone reporting a fact they had spent a long time working out. "Not because he cries, because he counts wrong on purpose." Ava was still sitting with that when she heard Lucas's footsteps in the corridor. He appeared at the edge of the lobby coat over his arm and stopped. He had clearly been moving quickly. He wasn't moving now. Sophie looked up at him. "I found Ava," she said. "She's the fairy tale lady from the coffee shop." Lucas looked at his daughter, then at Ava, with an expression that had too many things in it to sort quickly. "I know," he said. "I remember." He crossed the lobby and crouched down to Sophie's level. "You okay, Bug?" "I was reading," Sophie said with dignity. "I was fine." He straightened, and for a moment the 3 of them existed in the quiet of the lobby, without anyone trying to fill it. Then Lucas looked at Ava with the same deliberate quality she remembered from the coffee shop counter, like he was making a note again, adding something to a record he kept carefully. "Thank you," he said, "for sitting with her." "She's good company," Ava said, and meant it. Sophie beamed. The video surfaced on a Saturday morning. Ava was at the hospital visiting her father when her phone began vibrating with notifications she didn't recognize. Tags, shares, messages from numbers not in her contacts. She stepped into the hallway to look. The account was a local lifestyle page, with a modest following, the kind that posted neighborhood content and the occasional human interest clip. The caption read, "When a regular person pays for a struggling single dad's coffee, and turns out he's the CEO who just took over her company." Only in Seattle. The clip was 12 seconds, shot from behind and to the left, slightly blurry, the unmistakable interior of the corner coffee shop on 5th and Lenora. A woman stepping forward at a counter, a man with a child. 12 seconds. 47,000 views by the time Ava read the caption. She stood in the hospital corridor for a long moment. Then she went back into her father's room and didn't mention it. By Monday, it had crossed 200,000. 3 journalists had contacted Horizon Creative's general inbox requesting comment. A morning radio program had run a segment using only the publicly available details, describing the story, as in the host's words, the kind of thing that restores your faith a little. The comments were full of people projecting emotions onto a 12-second clip of 2 figures they couldn't identify clearly. Ava's name hadn't appeared in any of it yet. That changed Tuesday afternoon when a reporter connected the video to the Reed Capital acquisition announcement, and cross-referenced the employee directory. By Wednesday, there was a photographer outside her apartment building. The internal meeting happened Thursday morning. Lucas was already at the table when Ava arrived, along with 2 members of the board, and Diane Walsh, the head of communications, who had been brought in from Reed Capital's New York office, and who Ava had spoken to exactly once before this moment. Diane opened a folder. The proposal was clean and organized a short-form content series built around the story of Horizon Creative's cultural transformation, anchored by the coffee shop moment as its origin point. Employee testimonials, a before and after narrative, distribution across the company's owned channels and paid media. It had a title. It had a timeline. It had a budget figure that Ava didn't look at for long. "We'd want Ava to participate voluntarily," Diane said. "On camera, if she's comfortable. A brief interview, her own words, minimal scripting." Ava looked at the folder. "No." Diane looked up. "I'm not comfortable with it," Ava said. "I don't want to be part of a campaign." "We understand it's a big ask," one of the board members said in the tone of someone who had decided in advance that the ask wasn't actually that big. "But the organic attention this has generated is genuinely rare. The alignment with our messaging around workplace culture." "I understand the alignment," Ava said. "I'm still not comfortable with it." She looked at Lucas. He was watching her with the same focused attention he gave to everything in these rooms, but he hadn't spoken. She waited 1 beat too, and he didn't. The board member leaned forward. "Ava, we're not asking you to misrepresent anything. It's a true story." "It's my story," she said. "And I'm saying no." The meeting ended without resolution. Diane said they would revisit. The board member said he appreciated her candor. Lucas gathered his materials and didn't look at her again before leaving the room. She took the elevator down alone and stood in the lobby for a moment, with her hands flat against her thighs. She had expected, she realized, for him to say something. Not to override the board, not to make a speech. Just to say something even briefly that indicated he understood what they were asking her to absorb. He hadn't. She went back to her desk and worked until 6. The company event was held 2 Fridays later, an all-staff gathering in the main conference space, framed as a culture kickoff for the new quarter. Catered. Music from a speaker in the corner. The kind of event that was nominally optional and functionally mandatory. Ava attended because not attending would have said something she didn't want to say yet. 40 minutes in the lights dimmed for what Diane announced as a short video, a preview of the internal storytelling initiative. Ava assumed it was a mood reel, the kind of thing with time-lapse cityscapes and uplifting music. She was talking to a colleague from the design team and only half watching when the footage changed. The coffee shop, not the 12-second clip from the public video. This was longer, steadier, a different angle, one she didn't recognize. Security camera footage she understood immediately. Someone had obtained the full recording. The counter. The card reader. The man in the charcoal coat with his daughter beside him. And then a small voice clear through the conference room speakers. "You look like someone from a fairy tale." The laughter in the room was warm and genuine. People turned to look at Ava. Someone touched her shoulder. Someone else said her name like it was a good thing. Sophie's voice, coming through a speaker at a company event, used without anyone asking. Ava set down her drink. She turned toward the front of the room. Diane was standing near the screen with an expression that was waiting to be validated. "Turn it off," Ava said. The room shifted. "That footage includes a child," Ava said. She wasn't raising her voice, but she wasn't managing it either. She was just letting it be exactly as steady and clear as it needed to be. "A 6-year-old who did not consent to be recorded for your campaign. Her father did not consent. I did not consent. And you ran it anyway in front of the entire company without telling either of us it existed." Diane started to speak. "I'm not finished," Ava said. "You could have built your story about workplace culture on the 41 pages of documentation I submitted. on the employees who lost credit for their work for 4 years, on the people who are still here. But this was easier, wasn't it? A nice image. A child saying something sweet. The room was silent. Lucas was standing near the back wall. He was looking at her. He didn't move. Ava picked up her bag. "I'm withdrawing from the restructuring project," she said to no one in particular. "Effective today." She walked out. The elevator took a long time to arrive. She stood in front of the closed doors and kept her breathing even and her hands loose at her sides. When the doors finally opened, she stepped in, turned around, and caught one last glimpse of the conference room through the glass wall. Lucas was still standing where she'd left him. He still hadn't moved. The doors closed. That night, Ava drove home in the rain and sat in her car in the parking garage for longer than she meant to. She wasn't crying. She was doing the thing she did when something had happened, that she needed to process before she could put it down, running through it once cleanly from beginning to end. The meeting where she'd said no. Lucas sitting across the table and saying nothing. The conference room, the speakers, Sophie's voice, the walk out. She had done the right thing. She was certain of that. What she was less certain about, what sat in her chest on the drive home like a question without a comfortable answer, was whether she had done it in a way that left any room for anything else. Whether she had closed a door she hadn't fully decided to close. She went upstairs, made tea, and went to bed without resolving it. That weekend she drove to her father's house. Robert had been discharged 2 days after the conference room incident, and he was moving around his kitchen with the cautious confidence of a man who had been told to take it easy and was currently defining easy as loosely as possible. He was making soup when she arrived, standing at the stove, stirring something that smelled like the version of chicken soup he'd been making since she was 9 years old. She sat at the kitchen table and watched him for a while without saying anything. It was Saturday evening, the kitchen warm and closed the neighbor's television audible through the wall. Robert put a bowl in front of her, sat down across from her with his crossword book, and did not do the crossword. "You've been carrying your jaw like that since you walked in," he said. Ava looked up. "Like what?" "Like you're waiting for someone to tell you that you were wrong." "I wasn't wrong. I didn't say you were." Robert set down his pencil. "I said you're waiting for someone to tell you. There's a difference." She turned her spoon in the bowl. The kitchen was quiet. "I did everything right," she said, and even as she said it, she heard how flat it landed. "I documented everything. I submitted it. I stayed quiet when staying quiet was the only option I had. And when it finally mattered, when someone actually had the power to change something, the first thing they tried to do was turn it into content." Robert was quiet for a moment. "And the man who has that power, he didn't stop them. Not in the moment. No, but he hasn't made it harder for you either," her father said. "He hasn't pushed back, hasn't made noise about you withdrawing. Just nothing." Ava didn't answer. "You know what I've noticed about you," Robert said, "since you were about 9 years old. You help people before they've proven they deserve it. You always have." He picked up his pencil again, turning it in his fingers. "I'm just wondering when you decided that other people don't get the same grace period you give to strangers." She sat with that for a long time. She didn't have a good answer. Which was, she understood exactly the point. Lucas called Diane Walsh on Monday morning. Ava didn't know the details of that conversation until later, when pieces of it filtered through the company in the way information always traveled at Horizon sideways, in fragments, arriving at your desk, slightly misshapen from being passed through too many people. What she knew for certain was this: the content series was canceled. The contract with the external production company was terminated, with Lucas covering the penalty clause personally rather than charging it to the company budget. The security footage had been deleted from all internal servers. She knew this by Tuesday afternoon. On Wednesday, Lucas appeared at her desk, not in a conference room, not through his assistant. He walked across the open floor at 11:15 in the morning while people were working around them and stopped at the side of her desk the way a person does when they're not trying to make the approach seem like less than it is. "I should have said something in that first meeting when you declined," he said. And again when Diane presented the campaign. "I was trying to manage the board, and I let that override what I actually thought, which was that they were asking too much of you." He looked at her directly. "That was wrong. I'm telling you that plainly." Ava looked at him. He wasn't performing contrition, there was no inflection in it, no calculation about how it was landing. He was just saying the true thing and waiting. "You let a child's voice get used as marketing material," she said. "I know. Sophie didn't know she was being recorded that day." "I know that too," he said. "I've thought about it every day since." He didn't look away. "I'm not asking you to come back to the project. I wanted you to know that I understand what happened and that I'm sorry." The floor around them had the quality of a space where people were pretending very hard not to listen. Ava looked down at her desk, then back up at him. "How did they get the security footage?" "Diane requested it through facilities management. The approval should have required my sign-off. It didn't because someone in the chain decided it was a routine media request." His jaw tightened slightly. "That process has been corrected." She nodded once. He nodded back. He started to turn. "Lucas." The name came out before she'd fully decided to say it. He turned back. "The board," she said. "Are they going to make it difficult for you?" Something in his expression shifted, not surprise, but something quieter, like a small recalibration. "Probably," he said. "I'm going to present the policy framework next week regardless. The documentation you submitted is the backbone of it. I think the numbers will speak for themselves. And if they don't," he considered the question honestly, which she appreciated, "then I'll have done the right thing and lost the position," he said. "That's a livable outcome." She thought about her father at the kitchen table with his pencil, about grace periods. "Send me the draft," she said, "before you present it. I can tell you if anything in the documentation is being characterized incorrectly." Lucas looked at her for a moment. "I'll send it tonight." He walked back across the floor. At the desk to her left, her colleague Dana was staring at her screen with the focused intensity of someone who had not heard a single word of that exchange and intended to prove it. The board presentation was scheduled for the following Thursday at 2 in the afternoon. Lucas sent the draft Wednesday evening as he'd said. Ava read it at her kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside her. It was thorough. The documentation she had submitted had been rendered into data patterns, timelines, retention curves, the correlation between Trevor's tenure, and the attrition of the company's most experienced mid-level staff. Losses quantified. Not as grievances, but as business costs, which was the language the board would respond to. She sent back 4 corrections and 2 suggestions. Lucas incorporated all 6 by morning. She did not attend the presentation. She sat at her desk and worked on a project brief. At 4:17, an email arrived from Lucas's assistant. "Mr. Reed asked me to let you know the board approved the framework. Full implementation beginning next quarter." She read it twice. Then she opened the project she'd withdrawn from 3 weeks earlier, reviewed where she'd left off, and began writing the section she hadn't finished. Nobody made a formal announcement about her return. She didn't ask for one. She just came back the same way she'd always worked, by doing the work and trusting that it would speak for itself. The changes at Horizon Creative were not loud. They were the kind of changes that showed up in the texture of ordinary days, in the fact that the door-open sessions continued every week, without exception, in the updated health coverage summary that appeared in everyone's inbox one Tuesday morning, with a note explaining what had changed and why in the new performance documentation process that required cross-verification before any review was finalized. A formal policy protecting employees who reported misconduct, a designated HR contact independent of direct management chains. None of it made the company perfect. There were still difficult conversations, still misalignments between departments, still the ordinary friction of people working in proximity under pressure. But the friction was different now, the productive kind, the kind that came from people actually saying what they thought, rather than managing around what they feared. Ava noticed the difference most acutely in herself. She still kept detailed records that habit was too deeply ingrained to dissolve, but they felt different now. Less like evidence she might someday need. More like the ordinary documentation of someone who paid attention to her work. Under the new plan, her father's updated prescription was covered at 86%, a meaningful jump from the 70% she'd been working around for 2 years. The out-of-pocket gap she'd been calculating narrowed to something manageable, then closed. She transferred the amount she'd been setting aside back into her regular account, and for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, the number she saw when she checked her balance in the morning was not accompanied by a calculation. It was just a number, a sufficient one. 6 months after the all-hands meeting where Trevor Kane had been walked out of the building, Sophie Reed turned 7. Ava knew about the birthday because Sophie had mentioned it during one of her increasingly frequent after-school visits to the office. She had developed the habit of coming upstairs to find Ava if her father's meetings ran over, and Ava had developed the reciprocal habit of keeping a small box of colored pencils in her desk drawer for these occasions. Sophie used them to draw on the back of printed drafts that were going to recycling anyway, and produced with great seriousness a series of ongoing illustrations she described as the continuing adventures of the fairy tale lady and the unicorn. The unicorn Ava had gathered was a recurring character, its horn still only lit up in the dark. She gave Sophie a book for her birthday, a long one, the kind with chapters, because Sophie had been working her way through picture books with an impatience that suggested she was ready for something with more interior. Sophie received it with the solemnity of someone accepting a meaningful gift, turned to the first page, and read the opening paragraph on the spot while standing in the lobby with her backpack on. Lucas watched this from 2 feet away, with an expression that Ava had learned by now to read fairly accurately. It was the particular expression of a person witnessing something they had been hoping for and not entirely believing they would see. The morning was a Saturday in December, gray and wet in the way that Seattle Decembers always were, not dramatically stormy, but the kind of cold that settled in without announcement and stayed. Ava arrived at the coffee shop on the corner of 5th and Lenora before the rush took a table by the window and ordered her usual. She was reading something on her phone when the door opened and Sophie came in. First pulling Lucas by the hand with the purposeful energy of a child who had somewhere specific to be. Sophie saw Ava and redirected without hesitation, dragging her father across the room as though this had been the plan all along. "We found you," Sophie announced, climbing into the chair across from Ava as if it had been reserved. "You did," Ava said. Lucas stood at the end of the table, slightly damp from the walk over, and looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his default setting around her, attentive and unhurried, like he had allocated the time and intended to use it properly. "You have a usual thing on Saturday mornings?" he asked. "Just coffee," she said. "And the quiet before it gets crowded. We can find somewhere else." "I didn't say you should leave." He sat down. Sophie was already studying the laminated menu with the seriousness she brought to most reading material, running her finger along the hot chocolate options and making small sounds of consideration. Lucas watched her for a moment, then looked back at Ava. "The quarterly numbers came in yesterday," he said. "I saw the summary. Retention is up 11%. Design teams submitted 3 unsolicited improvement proposals last month." He said it without ceremony, the way he reported most things he was genuinely pleased about, as information, not performance. "The documentation framework is working." "Your documentation framework," Ava said. "Built on your documentation," he said. "There's a difference." Sophie set the menu down. "I want the one with the little marshmallows." "They all have marshmallows," Lucas said. The little ones, Sophie said with emphasis. Not the big ones. The big ones get soggy. Noted, he said. He caught the attention of the barista and ordered 1 hot chocolate with small marshmallows, specifically 1 coffee for Ava, when she nodded 1 coffee for himself. He produced his card when the total was given. The machine beeped. The good beep. He signed the receipt and slid it back across the counter. Ava looked at the 3 cups lined up on the pickup shelf, 1 small, 1 medium, and felt something settle in her chest. Not a dramatic settling, not the resolution of a long tension. Just the quiet sense of something being where it was supposed to be. You finally paid, she said. Lucas carried the cups to the table and set them down, distributing them with the care of a person accustomed to balancing 3 things at once. Sophie pulled her hot chocolate close and inspected the marshmallows with visible satisfaction. I wasn't paying back the coffee, he said. He sat down across from her. I was looking for a reason to sit here. Ava looked at him. He held her gaze with the same straightforward quality he brought to everything. Not performing confidence, just present, waiting for whatever came next, with the patience of someone who had learned not to rush the things that mattered. That's a long way to go for a cup of coffee, she said. It's a good coffee shop, he said. Sophie looked up from her marshmallows. You're both being weird, she informed them. She took a sip. She set the cup down and picked up a colored pencil from the small case she carried everywhere, because of course she did, and opened her notebook to a blank page. I'm going to draw the fairy tale lady and the unicorn, she announced. You two can keep talking. Outside, the rain moved across the window in slow sheets. The coffee shop filled gradually around them, the way it always did on Saturday mornings, with the sounds of people arriving out of the cold and finding their places. 3 cups on the table. 1 for Sophie, 1 for Lucas, 1 for Ava. Nobody moved to leave. Ava wrapped her hands around her cup and looked at the window, then back at the table. Then at the small figure across from her drawing, with the focused intensity of a child who knew exactly what she was making. Sometimes, a small act of kindness didn't reorder the world. It just found the people it was meant to find, and stayed.